Mara Voss had spent 6 years doing a job nobody noticed. She was the supply clerk for a small mountain rescue and security unit stationed near a remote border region. Her job was simple on paper: count ammunition crates, track equipment, fill out forms, and make sure the real shooters had what they needed. She had never been on a real mission. She had never been asked to be. Most days, she didn't mind. She liked her quiet corner of the base, her paperwork, and her evenings at the old practice range, where she would lie down in the dirt and shoot at distant targets just to clear her head. Nobody on the team took her range time seriously. They called it her hobby. Corporal Diaz, the team's best spotter, used to tease her about it every time he walked past. "One day, Voss," he'd say, grinning, "we're going to hand you the big rifle and see what happens." It was a joke. Everyone laughed. Even Voss laughed. She never thought it would actually happen. Then came a Tuesday that started like any other and ended like nothing she had ever known. The team's lead sniper, Staff Sergeant Holt, had torn his shoulder 2 days earlier during a training exercise. He was out of action, his arm in a sling, frustrated and useless for anything beyond giving orders over the radio. The unit was already short-staffed that week. Their second shooter, a quiet young soldier named Reyes, woke up that morning with a stomach illness so severe he could barely stand, let alone hold a rifle steady. The team needed eyes and a steady hand on a ridge overlooking the valley, and they needed it within the hour. That was when someone, half-joking, suggested Voss. At first, the suggestion was laughed off, the way every joke about her range time had always been laughed off. But the laughter died quickly when no one else stepped forward. The team commander, a serious man named Captain Reyes, no relation to the sick soldier, looked around the room and realized there was no one else available. Voss had logged more range hours than anyone gave her credit for. She had never missed a single qualification test. She was, technically, capable. "Voss," Captain Reyes said, "get your gear. You're going up the ridge with Diaz." Voss stared at him for a moment, certain she had misheard. "Sir, I'm supply. I've never." "You've never been needed before," he said. "You're needed now." Within 20 minutes, she was climbing into a transport vehicle with Diaz, a heavy rifle case strapped across her back, her hands trembling slightly despite her best effort to steady them. Diaz, usually full of jokes, was quiet during the ride. He kept glancing at her, as if trying to decide whether this was still funny or whether it had become something else entirely. "You're going to be fine," he said finally, breaking the silence. "I'll call everything. You just follow my numbers." "What if I can't do it?" Voss asked. "Then we'll find another way," Diaz said. "But I don't think that's going to happen." The ridge they reached was high and cold, swept by a wind that never seemed to settle in one direction for more than a few seconds. From their position, the valley below spread out like a painted map, a winding dirt road, a cluster of stone buildings, and, parked beside the largest building, a single transport truck that should not have been there. Diaz explained the situation as he set up his spotting scope. Inside that building, a group of 8 workers and 2 engineers were being held against their will by an armed group that had taken over the small village days earlier. Local negotiators had been trying to resolve the situation peacefully, but talks had broken down that morning. Intelligence reports said the captors planned to move their hostages using the truck parked outside, and once that truck left the village, finding the hostages again would become far more difficult, maybe impossible. The rescue team's plan depended on stopping that truck before it could leave. Ground teams were moving into position, but they needed more time to get close enough to act safely. The only way to buy that time was to disable the truck's engine from a distance, quietly and without warning shots that might cause the captors to panic and harm anyone inside the building. There was only one position on the entire mountainside with a clear line of sight to the truck's engine block. It was the ridge where Voss and Diaz now lay, flat on cold stone, the wind tugging at their jackets. The distance, Diaz announced after checking his rangefinder twice, was 3,540 meters. He said the number out loud, then said it again, as if expecting it to change. It didn't change. "That's not possible," Voss whispered, staring at the small shape of the truck through her scope, barely larger than a grain of rice at that distance. "It's not impossible," Diaz said. "Difficult, yes. Impossible, no. People have made shots at this range before. Not many. But it's been done." Voss felt her stomach tighten. She had trained for distances of a few hundred meters, maybe 1,000 on her best days at the range. This was more than 3 times that. At this distance, the bullet wouldn't travel in anything resembling a straight line. It would rise, arc, and fall over several seconds, drifting sideways with every gust of wind along the way. By the time it reached the truck, more than 4 seconds would have passed since she pulled the trigger. The world would have moved. The wind would have shifted. Everything would be different from the moment she fired to the moment the bullet landed. Captain Reyes's voice crackled over the radio. Ground team needs 8 more minutes. If that truck starts moving before then, we lose our window. Can you make the shot? Diaz looked at Voss. For the first time since she'd known him, there was no joke in his expression. Your call, he said quietly. I'll back whatever you decide. But if you can do this, now's the time. Voss closed her eyes for 1 second. She thought about every quiet evening she'd spent at the practice range, every round she'd fired into paper targets while everyone else thought she was wasting her time. She thought about the people inside that building, waiting, frightened, with no idea that 2 strangers on a mountain 3.5 kilometers away were their best chance at staying safe. I can try, she said. Good enough, Diaz said. Let's get to work. What followed was not a single dramatic moment but 9 long minutes of careful, exhausting calculation. Diaz called out wind readings from 3 different points between the ridge and the valley floor, using small puffs of dust and the bending of distant grass to estimate speed and direction at each altitude. The wind near the ridge blew steady from the west. Halfway down the mountain, it curled unpredictably around a rock formation. Near the valley floor, it settled into a gentle crosswind that could push a bullet sideways by several meters over the course of its flight. Voss adjusted her scope settings with shaking fingers, dialing in numbers Diaz called out, recalculating each time the wind shifted even slightly. She had to account not only for the wind, but for the curve of the earth itself, the drop of the bullet over such an enormous distance, and the truck's distance from various obstacles that could interfere with a clean shot. Sight her round first, Diaz said. We confirm the line before we commit to anything real. Voss took a slow breath, settled her cheek against the rifle's stock, and fired a single round, not aimed at the truck itself, but at a patch of open ground beside it, a deliberate test shot to see how close their calculations had come. The recoil rocked through her shoulder. 5 seconds passed in silence. Then Diaz, watching through his scope, called out the result. Low and left. Adjust up 2 clicks, right 1 click. Voss made the adjustments with steady hands, the trembling from earlier completely gone now, replaced by a strange, focused calm she hadn't expected to feel. There was no room left in her mind for fear. There was only the math, the wind, and the truck. 90 seconds, Captain Reyes's voice crackled again. Ground team is close. If that truck doesn't start, this is over without you needing to fire again. For a moment, it seemed like that might happen. The truck sat still, its engine quiet, no sign of movement from the building beside it. Voss allowed herself to hope the entire ordeal might end peacefully, without her needing to fire a single shot at the real target. Then the building's door opened. 2 armed figures emerged, walking toward the truck. A third followed, herding 2 visibly frightened captives ahead of him toward the vehicle's open back doors. They're moving them, Diaz said, his voice tightening. Truck's about to start. Voss, if you're going to do this, it's now. Voss steadied her breathing, found her target through the scope, not the people, never the people, only the small dark shape of the engine block beneath the hood, the one part of the entire scene she had permission and reason to aim at. She accounted for the time the bullet would spend in flight, nearly 5 full seconds, calculating where the stationary engine block would still be once that time passed, factoring in nothing but distance and wind, since the target itself would not move. She exhaled half a breath, the way she'd practiced 1,000 times on the quiet range nobody had ever taken seriously, and gently pressed the trigger. The rifle's report rolled across the mountainside, swallowed almost instantly by distance and wind. 5 long seconds passed. Diaz didn't breathe. Voss didn't breathe. Down in the valley, nothing visible happened for a moment that felt far longer than 5 seconds. Then a thin curl of smoke rose from beneath the truck's hood. Diaz let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, though there was no humor in it, only disbelief and overwhelming relief. Engines hit, he said into the radio, his voice steadier than Voss expected. Truck is disabled. Repeat, target vehicle is disabled. Distance from firing position, 3,540 meters. There was a pause on the radio, long enough that Voss wondered if anyone had heard him correctly. Then Captain Reyes's voice came back, quieter than before. Confirmed. Ground team moving in now. Good work, both of you. Down in the valley, confusion erupted around the truck as the armed men realized their vehicle wouldn't start. In the chaos that followed, the rescue team's ground unit closed the remaining distance faster than anyone had expected, using the unexpected delay to secure the area and bring the hostages to safety without further incident. No one was harmed. The engineers and aid workers, shaken but unhurt, were guided away from the building within minutes, and the armed group, suddenly without their planned escape vehicle and surrounded by approaching rescue forces, surrendered without further resistance. Voss lay on the cold ridge for a long moment after the radio confirmed the rescue success, her hands finally beginning to shake again now that there was nothing left to calculate, nothing left to hold steady for. Diaz reached over and gave her shoulder a firm, grateful squeeze. "You did it," he said. "I genuinely did not think that shot was possible." "Neither did I," Voss admitted. When the full report was filed later that week, military analysts who reviewed the data confirmed what Diaz had already suspected on the ridge: the shot Voss had taken, accounting for verified distance, environmental conditions, and flight time, ranked among the longest precision shots ever recorded in the unit's history, and one of the longest disabling shots documented in any rescue operation on file. It became something of a quiet legend among the small community of long-range shooters who heard about it afterward, not because anyone was harmed, but because of what the shot had prevented, and because of who had taken it. News of the rescue spread through the base quickly, though Voss's name attached to the shot spread even faster. People who had barely spoken to her before suddenly wanted to know everything about the quiet supply clerk who had apparently been hiding a remarkable skill behind years of paperwork and forms. Reporters who covered the rescue operation asked to speak with her, curious how someone with no combat sniper experience had managed what some of the most experienced shooters in the region had never attempted. Voss answered their questions politely but briefly, never quite comfortable with the attention. When one journalist asked whether she planned to formally train as a sniper after such a remarkable performance, she shook her head with a small, tired smile. "I didn't do anything special," she said. "I just didn't want to miss when it actually mattered." The rest was Diaz calling the wind and a lot of luck holding still long enough for the math to work out. Diaz, standing nearby during the interview, rolled his eyes good-naturedly. "Don't let her fool you," he told the reporter. "That wasn't luck. That was the steadiest hand I've ever spotted for, and I've spotted for a lot of people." In the weeks that followed, life on the base slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Voss went back to her supply tent, back to counting ammunition crates and filing equipment forms, just as she had for 6 quiet years before that Tuesday changed everything. But in the evenings, when she walked past the old practice range, the soldiers who once teased her about wasting her time there now nodded with quiet respect instead, sometimes even asking if they could join her for a few rounds, hoping to learn even a fraction of whatever steadiness had carried her through that impossible afternoon on the ridge. Voss never thought of herself as anyone special. She still preferred her quiet corner of the base, her paperwork, and her solitary evenings on the range. But she carried with her now a memory she would never forget, the memory of 9 long minutes on a windswept mountain, a rifle that shouldn't have reached as far as it did, and the simple, steady decision to try, even when trying seemed impossible. And somewhere in a small village far below that ridge, a group of people who had once feared they might never go home again carried their own memory of that same afternoon, the memory of an engine that mysteriously failed at exactly the right moment, giving them the precious few minutes they needed to be saved.